The alarm on my console had never sounded like that before, and I had served on this station for over 60 cycles. I am Corin Vale, junior attaché to the Galactic Council, and on the day the humans arrived, I was standing in the observation deck when the proximity sensors screamed a warning that made every officer around me freeze in place. A single vessel had entered the outer boundary of Council space, not a fleet, not an escort. One ship, moving with a calm that felt wrong given how deep it had already pushed into territory that species far older than humanity would never dare approach without permission. I remember the silence in the command room. Nobody spoke. The tactical officers stared at their screens as if the numbers might change if they looked hard enough. The ship was small compared to Council standards, barely larger than a transport vessel, yet something about its shape made my skin tighten. It did not look built for show. It looked built for one purpose, and that purpose was not diplomacy. High Counselor Threll, the administrator who oversaw all first contact protocols, ordered the station to hold position and prepare a greeting party. He was not worried. None of the senior officials were. To them, humanity was still the newest member species, barely a decade into formal recognition, still finding its place at the bottom of a hierarchy that had existed for 10,000 years. They expected humility. They expected caution. They expected the same careful, deferential behavior every other young species had shown when first standing before the Council. I had studied humans for the last 2 years, ever since their homeworld was granted provisional status. I had read their history, their conflicts, their strange refusal to stay in any category assigned to them. I had tried, more than once, to explain to my superiors that humans did not behave like other new species, that their calm was not weakness, that their silence was not submission. Every time, I was told to focus on my assigned duties and leave strategic assessment to the elders. So when the single ship requested docking clearance and stated its purpose only as diplomatic exchange, I felt a knot form in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of an attack, and everything to do with the growing sense that we did not understand what we were dealing with. The ship docked without incident. 2 humans disembarked, a tall man with short dark hair, calm eyes, and posture that suggested military training, and a woman beside him whose name I would later learn was Laura Bennett, the appointed diplomatic envoy for humanity's continued relations with the Council. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that unsettled the honor guard assigned to escort her. I was present at the welcoming ceremony, standing near the back of the hall as tradition required for someone of my rank. The Council held these ceremonies with rigid formality, a series of bows, greetings, and ritual gestures meant to establish the natural order between the ancient governing body and whichever species stood before it. Every new member was expected to kneel before the central seal, a gesture symbolizing acceptance of the Council's authority. It was not written into any formal treaty. It was simply expected, the way certain traditions become law through repetition rather than decree. Laura Bennett did not kneel. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect by human standards, and remained standing. The hall went quiet. I watched Counselor Threll's expression shift from practiced pleasantness to something colder, something I recognized from years of watching him deal with species he considered beneath him. He asked her, through the translation matrix, why she refused the traditional gesture of acknowledgement. She answered simply that her government did not require its representatives to kneel before any foreign power, but that she meant no disrespect, and that humanity valued the relationship it was building with the Council. It was a diplomatic answer. A reasonable one. I remember thinking, foolishly, that the moment would pass, that Threll would accept the explanation and move the ceremony forward. Instead, I watched something settle behind his eyes, a quiet decision being made that I did not yet understand the weight of. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Threll smiled. He welcomed the humans warmly, offered them quarters aboard the station, and assured them that a full diplomatic exchange would begin the following day. Laura Bennett and her escort, a soldier named Ethan Cole, were shown to guest chambers reserved for visiting dignitaries. I did not think much of the exchange that night. I had my own duties, reports to file, translations to review. It was not until the following morning that I learned Laura Bennett was dead. The official report, distributed quietly through internal channels before any public statement was made, described her death as an unfortunate accident involving a malfunction in the station's atmospheric regulation system within her guest quarters. It stated that the malfunction had gone undetected for several hours during the night cycle, and that by the time station staff discovered the issue, nothing could be done. I read that report 3 times before I allowed myself to consider what I actually believed. The atmospheric systems on this station had never malfunctioned in the 6 decades I had served here. Every guest chamber, especially those reserved for dignitaries, was monitored continuously by systems with redundant fail-safes, specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of failure described in the report. I was not in the room when it happened. I want to be honest about that, because I do not wish to claim knowledge I do not have. But I had been near Counselor Threll's private office 2 nights prior, delivering a translated document, when I overheard a conversation through a door that had not been fully sealed. Threll's voice, low and controlled, discussing with an aide the need to correct what he called an insult to the Council's authority, before it could be repeated by future representatives of the same species. I did not understand the full meaning of those words, until the following morning's report reached my desk. I told no one what I had heard. I want to be honest about that too. I was young, by Council standards, still building my career within a system that rewarded obedience and quietly destroyed those who questioned their superiors. I told myself that perhaps I had misunderstood the conversation, that perhaps the timing was coincidence, that perhaps I was allowing my study of humanity to color my perception of events that had a simpler explanation. Ethan Cole, the soldier who had accompanied Laura Bennett, was informed of her death that same morning. I watched from a distance as station officials delivered the news to him in a private meeting room. I could not hear what was said, but I watched his posture through the observation window. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand answers in the way I expected a grieving companion might. He simply listened, nodded once, and requested permission to return to his ship to inform his government of the incident. Permission was granted almost eagerly. I think, looking back, that the Council was relieved to see him leave quietly, rather than create a scene that might draw attention to a death that did not survive close inspection. The human ship departed Council space within 6 hours of Laura Bennett's death, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than mourning. For a few days, life aboard the station returned to its usual rhythm. The official cause of death was recorded, condolences were prepared for transmission to Earth, and the Council moved forward with its business, as though nothing significant had occurred. I heard senior officials joke quietly in the corridors about how humanity's first true test before the Council had ended in such an unfortunate but understandable way, as though the loss of a living person was simply an inconvenient footnote in an otherwise smooth diplomatic exchange. I did not laugh with them. I began paying closer attention to the communications logs from Earth over the following weeks, partly out of professional duty, partly because something in my chest refused to settle. The condolence transmission the Council sent was acknowledged by Earth's government within a single day, a response so brief it barely qualified as a message at all. It simply stated that Earth had received the notification and would respond through proper channels once its own review of the incident was complete. No further communication followed. I found this unusual, given how quickly humans had responded to every previous message from the Council, often within hours, sometimes with lengthy replies discussing trade agreements or scientific exchange. Their sudden silence stood out against a pattern of engagement that had, until that point, seemed almost eager. I raised the matter with my direct supervisor, a mid-level administrator named Doran Kess, suggesting that the lack of response might be worth monitoring closely. He dismissed my concerns, telling me that young species often needed time to process loss, according to their own customs, and that humanity's silence was simply a sign of grief, nothing more. I wanted to believe him. It would have been easier to believe him. But I kept thinking about the calm on Ethan Cole's face as he received the news of Laura Bennett's death. I kept thinking about how he had not argued, had not accused anyone, had not demanded an investigation before returning to his ship. At the time, I mistook that calm for shock, or perhaps a kind of emotional restraint, typical of a soldier trained to control his reactions in front of foreign officials. I understand now that I was wrong. That calm was not restraint born of shock. It was the calm of someone who already knew exactly what would happen next, and did not need to say a single word to make it happen. 3 weeks after Laura Bennett's death, Every human trade vessel operating within Council space received simultaneous recall orders from Earth. Every scientific exchange program was suspended without explanation. Every scheduled diplomatic meeting was quietly cancelled, one after another, until the entire framework of engagement between humanity and the Council had gone still. I remember standing in the communications hub the day the last human vessel departed Council territory, watching its signature vanish from our tracking systems. The officer beside me remarked that it felt strange to see the sector so quiet again, as though humanity had simply lost interest and drifted back toward its own affairs. I did not share his relief. Something about the precision of the withdrawal, the way every ship left according to the same schedule, the same route, the same quiet efficiency, told me this was not disinterest. This was not fear. This was preparation. Though for what, I could not yet say. I began keeping my own private notes on the situation, separate from official station records, because I feared that if I raised my concerns too loudly, I would be dismissed from my post before anyone took the warning seriously. I documented the timeline, the ceremony, the overheard conversation outside Threll's office, the suspicious speed of the official report, the unnatural calm of Ethan Cole, the sudden, total withdrawal of human presence from Council space. I did not know what these details meant when placed together. I only knew that something was building, quietly, beneath the surface of Council politics, and that nobody around me seemed willing to ask the question that had begun to keep me awake at night. What happens when a species that has always answered violence with negotiation instead answers with something else entirely? I did not have to wait long to find out. For nearly 2 months, Council space carried on without a single human vessel crossing its borders. I continued my work, translating reports, attending briefings, watching the slow machinery of galactic politics grind forward as though nothing had changed. But I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted beneath the surface, something the senior officials refused to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting they had made a mistake they could not undo. I spent much of that time trying to understand humanity through every record available to me. I reviewed their historical archives, provided as part of the standard cultural exchange when they first joined the Council's registry of recognized species. Humans had a long history of conflict among themselves, yet what struck me most was not the frequency of their disagreements, but the pattern of how they resolved the ones that mattered most. They did not send warnings before they acted. They did not posture or threaten. When they finally decided that words had failed, they moved with a speed and thoroughness that left little room for negotiation afterward. I brought this observation to Doran Kess again, hoping that a second attempt might land differently than the first. I explained that humanity's silence did not match any pattern of grief or diplomatic caution I could find in their history. I explained that their sudden, coordinated withdrawal looked less like retreat and more like preparation. He listened this time at least, though his response still carried the same dismissive confidence I had grown used to. He reminded me that humanity possessed no fleet capable of threatening Council space in any meaningful way. Our sensors had catalogued their military capacity years earlier during the initial contact surveys, and by every measurable standard, their technology remained generations behind our own. He told me that whatever humans were doing, it could not possibly involve any credible threat to the Council, and that my time would be better spent on my actual assignments, rather than chasing theories built on a soldier's facial expression and an overheard conversation I could not even prove had taken place. I did not argue further. There was no point. But I continued my private notes, and I continued watching, because something in me refused to accept that a species capable of building starships and joining a 10,000-year-old governing body would simply disappear into silence without purpose. During this period, Councillor Threll rose in influence within the Council's inner circles. The incident involving Laura Bennett had been quietly filed away as an unfortunate accident, and with humanity apparently withdrawn and unresponsive, there was no one left to challenge the official account. Threll used the following weeks to strengthen his position among the other administrators, presenting himself as the steady hand who had managed a delicate situation with the newest member species without incident, despite what I knew to be the truth hiding beneath his carefully worded reports. I watched him during council sessions, listening to him speak with the same practiced confidence he had shown the night Laura Bennett died. I found myself studying his face for any sign of doubt, any flicker of concern about what silence from an entire species might actually mean. I found none. He seemed genuinely convinced that humanity's withdrawal confirmed exactly what he had always believed about them, that they were simply another young species learning their place within the established order, choosing caution over confrontation, because confrontation against the Council had never once ended well for any species that attempted it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I did not have the standing to do so, and even if I had, I doubt he would have listened to a junior attaché whose only evidence was a feeling he could not quantify. 6 weeks into the silence, a routine long-range sensor sweep detected unusual activity near the boundary separating Council space from territory claimed by no recognized power, a region simply referred to as the Outer Dark by those of us who monitored deep space traffic. The activity was minimal, barely more than a flicker across our detection grid, gone before analysts could gather enough data to determine its source with certainty. The report noted only that whatever caused the reading was moving with unusual speed and left no identifiable signature matching any known vessel class in our databases. I requested access to that sensor data, citing my ongoing interest in human behavioral patterns as justification. My request was approved without much scrutiny, since few officials considered the flicker significant enough to warrant restricted access. What I found, when I reviewed the raw readings myself rather than relying on the summarized report, unsettled me in a way I struggled to explain to my colleagues. The signature, brief as it was, matched nothing in our records, but it shared certain structural characteristics with the propulsion signature logged from the single human vessel that had first arrived at our station months earlier. Not an exact match, but close enough that I began to suspect humanity had not withdrawn out of fear or grief at all. They had withdrawn to build something, quietly, in a region of space too remote for our sensors to monitor effectively. I brought this finding to Doran Kess a third time, and for the first time, I saw genuine concern cross his expression, though he still refused to escalate the matter beyond our department. He told me that raising unconfirmed theories to the senior council would damage both our credibility, and that without stronger evidence, no one would take the claim seriously enough to act on it. He suggested I continue monitoring quietly, gathering more data before attempting to bring the matter forward again. I agreed, though reluctantly, because I understood the political reality, even as it frustrated me. Within a hierarchy built on 10,000 years of unchallenged authority, the idea that a species barely a decade into formal recognition might pose any genuine threat was almost unthinkable. Admitting the possibility meant admitting that the entire foundation the Council stood on, the assumption that fear only ever flowed downward from the ancient powers to the newer ones, might not be as stable as everyone believed. I continued my monitoring in the weeks that followed, cross-referencing every scrap of data I could access without drawing attention to my activities. I noticed patterns emerging slowly, faint traces of activity, along the outer boundary, that never lasted long enough to be conclusively identified, but occurred with increasing frequency as the weeks passed. Something was moving out there, methodically, patiently, and whatever it was, it showed no interest in announcing itself. During this same period, I attempted to reach out through informal channels to contacts I had made among trade representatives from species with closer historical ties to Earth. Most of them had also lost contact with their human counterparts, though a few mentioned receiving brief, formal communications confirming that Earth remained stable and functioning, without offering any further explanation for the extended silence toward the Council specifically. This detail struck me as significant. Humanity had not withdrawn from galactic society as a whole. They had withdrawn specifically from us. I began to suspect that whatever was happening was not born of fear, panic, or grief, but of a decision, made deliberately and carried out with discipline, to disengage entirely from an institution that had allowed one of its own representatives to die without consequence. The realization settled over me slowly, the way cold water seeps through fabric before you notice you are soaked through. This was not a species retreating. This was a species preparing a response, and the fact that they had not yet announced what that response might be frightened me more than any open threat could have. I raised my concerns one final time before the silence broke, this time attempting to bypass Doran Kess entirely and request a brief audience with a member of the senior council directly. My request was denied on procedural grounds, citing my rank and the absence of confirmed evidence to justify elevating the matter beyond departmental review. I remember sitting alone in my quarters that night, staring at the notes I had compiled over the past 2 months, feeling a helplessness I had never experienced in my career. I could see the shape of what was coming, even without understanding its exact form. I could feel it the way one feels a storm building on the horizon, long before the first drop of rain falls, a pressure in the air that everyone around me seemed determined to ignore. 2 nights later, every long-range sensor array across the outer boundary lit up simultaneously, and for the first time in months, humanity announced its return to council space in a way that left absolutely no room for anyone to dismiss what was happening as mere coincidence or misinterpreted data. A single vessel had crossed the boundary, and every system that detected it agreed on one unsettling fact. It was moving directly toward the very station where Laura Bennett had died. I stood in the command center when the readings first appeared, and within minutes, every senior officer on duty had gathered around the tactical display, watching the single contact move steadily toward us, with a calm that felt more threatening than any aggressive maneuver could have been. There was no evasive movement, no attempt to mask its approach, no burst of speed suggesting urgency. It simply moved forward, at a measured pace, as though its arrival had already been decided long before it ever crossed into our sensor range. Counselor Threll arrived on the command deck within the hour, his expression carrying the same practiced confidence I had grown accustomed to over the past months. He ordered the station's defense grid activated as a precaution, though he assured everyone present that a single vessel posed no genuine threat to a station of our size and defensive capability. He reminded the room that humanity's technology remained generations behind our own, and that whatever this approach represented, it was almost certainly a delayed diplomatic gesture rather than any form of confrontation. I wanted to believe him. I truly did. But something about the tactical readings unsettled every analyst in the room, myself included. The vessel's hull registered almost no identifiable weapon signatures according to our scanning systems, yet something about its construction resisted deeper analysis in a way none of our technical staff could explain. Every attempt to gather more detailed information about its internal systems returned incomplete or inconsistent results, as though the ship itself was built to reveal only what it wanted us to see. The vessel requested docking clearance once it reached optimal range, transmitting the request in the same calm, formal tone that Laura Bennett had used months earlier, during humanity's first arrival. Threll granted clearance without hesitation, eager, I suspected, to demonstrate to the rest of the council that he remained fully in control of the situation involving Earth's representatives. I requested permission to be present during the greeting, citing my ongoing study of human diplomatic behavior as justification. Given the tension in the room, my request was approved with little scrutiny, and I found myself standing once again in the same hall where Laura Bennett had refused to kneel months earlier, waiting to see who, or what, would step off that ship. A single figure disembarked. Tall, composed, dressed in a simple dark uniform, without the ceremonial markings previous human representatives had worn during formal visits. I recognized him immediately. It was Ethan Cole, the soldier who had accompanied Laura Bennett on her final visit, the same man who had received news of her death with a calm that had haunted me for months. He did not carry any visible weapon. He did not bring an entourage or additional escort. He walked alone through the greeting hall, his footsteps echoing against the polished floor in a silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Counselor Threll stepped forward to offer the traditional welcome, his voice carrying the same warm, practiced tone he had used with Laura Bennett, as though nothing about this meeting differed from any other diplomatic exchange the council had conducted over the centuries. Ethan Cole did not respond to the greeting immediately. He stood at the center of the hall, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled officials, before settling on Threll, with an expression I can only describe as perfectly, unnervingly calm. He spoke a single sentence through the translation matrix, his voice level, without anger, without threat, without any of the emotional weight I had expected given the circumstances of his last visit to this station. He asked for confirmation of the name of the individual responsible for issuing the order that resulted in Laura Bennett's death. The hall fell silent. I watched Threll's expression falter for just a moment, before he recovered his composure. insisting that her death had been a tragic accident involving a system malfunction, exactly as the official report had stated months earlier. He offered his condolences again, expressing regret on behalf of the entire council for the unfortunate circumstances surrounding her passing. Ethan Cole listened to the response without interruption. When Threll finished speaking, Cole nodded once, the same small, controlled gesture I remembered from the day he received news of her death. He stated, in the same level tone, that Earth's own investigation into the incident had reached a different conclusion, one supported by independent analysis of the station's technical records obtained through channels he did not specify. He did not accuse anyone directly. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated that Earth now possessed a complete understanding of what had happened aboard this station, and that his presence here today was not a request for further explanation, but a formal notification that a decision had already been made regarding how humanity intended to respond. I felt the temperature in the room seem to drop, though nothing about the environmental systems had changed. Threll asked, with a note of genuine confusion beginning to creep into his otherwise composed voice, what exactly that decision entailed. Ethan Cole answered with 7 words that I have never been able to forget, delivered without any theatrical pause, without any attempt to draw out the tension of the moment. He simply stated that the species responsible would no longer exist. For a moment, nobody in the hall reacted, as though the translation matrix must have produced an error, some glitch in the language processing that had garbled his intended meaning into something far more severe than he could possibly have meant. Threll actually laughed, a short, uncertain sound, before asking Cole to clarify his statement, reminding him that council law strictly prohibited any threat of aggression made within a diplomatic setting, regardless of the grievance behind it. Cole did not raise his voice or repeat himself. He simply stated that this was not a threat, but a notification, delivered as a matter of respect for the relationship that had once existed between Earth and the Council, so that no one present could later claim they had not been given the opportunity to understand what was coming. He then turned, without waiting for a response, and walked back toward his ship with the same measured pace he had used entering the hall. Station security moved to intercept him, uncertain how to respond to what had just occurred, but Threll, his composure fully returning, ordered them to stand down, insisting that detaining a diplomatic representative would violate protocols far more serious than anything Cole had just said. I watched the human ship depart council space within the hour, moving at the same unhurried pace it had used to arrive. The command center dissolved into a flurry of debate immediately afterward, senior officials arguing over how seriously to treat what had just happened. Some dismissed it entirely, insisting that a single soldier making a dramatic statement carried no actual military weight given humanity's known technological limitations. Others, myself included, sat in stunned silence, replaying Cole's words over and over, searching for any possible interpretation that did not carry the full weight of what he had actually said. Threll addressed the room shortly after, attempting to restore calm among the officials present. He explained that humanity likely intended this visit as a symbolic gesture of protest, a way of expressing displeasure, without any real capacity to act on such a statement. He reminded everyone that our own defensive capabilities far exceeded anything humanity had demonstrated during their brief time within council space, and that whatever Cole meant by his statement, it posed no credible threat to an institution that had endured for 10,000 years. I did not share his confidence, though I said nothing during the meeting, aware that my previous warnings had already cost me credibility among my superiors. I returned to my quarters that night and reviewed my notes one final time, adding Cole's exact words to the record I had been keeping since the day Laura Bennett died. I remember sitting in silence for a long time afterward, unable to shake the feeling that I had just witnessed something far more significant than a diplomatic protest. Over the following days, the council convened several closed sessions to discuss the incident, though I was not permitted to attend given my rank. Rumors circulated quickly among the staff, most dismissing the encounter as an empty gesture, a few expressing quiet unease that mirrored my own. I continued monitoring sensor activity along the outer boundary, watching for any sign of the buildup I had detected in the weeks before Cole's arrival, but the readings remained quiet, almost unnaturally so, as though whatever had been assembling out there had either finished its preparations or moved somewhere our systems could no longer detect. 5 days after Ethan Cole's visit, Long-range communication arrays across 3 separate council outposts near the boundary of Threll's home system went dark within the same hour, their signals cutting off mid-transmission without warning or explanation. Initial reports suggested a widespread technical failure, though the simultaneous nature of the outage across multiple independent systems made that explanation increasingly difficult to accept as investigators began digging deeper into what had actually occurred. I remember standing in the communications hub when the first images finally arrived from a scout vessel dispatched to investigate the silence, and I remember the specific, sick feeling that settled into my chest as those images filled the display in front of me, because nothing in my years of study had prepared me for what I saw on that screen. The images showed no wreckage scattered across open space, no debris field marking a battle that had taken place. Instead, the 3 outposts sat intact, their outer hulls untouched, their structures fully visible against the dark backdrop of the system they orbited. What had changed was everything inside them. The scout vessel's initial scans reported that every power core across all 3 stations had been shut down simultaneously, not destroyed, not damaged, simply deactivated in a manner so precise that engineers reviewing the data later described it as surgical. Every defense system had been disabled before it could fire a single shot. Every communication array had been silenced before a distress signal could be sent. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of any external vessel making physical contact with the stations at all. I remember the confusion in the command center as engineers struggled to explain how something like this could happen without any detectable point of intrusion. Some suggested an internal sabotage effort, though that theory collapsed quickly once personnel records confirmed that every crew member aboard all 3 outposts had simply been rendered unconscious rather than harmed, discovered later in stable condition by rescue teams sent to assess the situation. Not a single life had been lost, not a single structure had been physically damaged, and yet, every strategic function those outposts had once served, every weapon, every sensor array, every defensive capability, had been rendered completely and precisely useless. I understood, standing there watching those reports come in, that this was not an attack in any sense the Council recognized. This was a demonstration, a message delivered not through destruction, but through absolute, controlled restraint that somehow felt more unsettling than open conflict ever could have. Councillor Threll convened an emergency session within hours, and this time, given the scale of what had occurred, I was permitted to attend as part of the analytical staff providing background on humanity's known capabilities. I sat quietly near the rear of the chamber, listening as senior officials debated furiously over what had happened and what it meant for the Council's response going forward. Some officials argued that this proved humanity possessed technology far beyond what our surveys had previously detected, technology capable of disabling entire stations without ever making physical contact. Others argued the opposite, insisting that the lack of any casualties suggested humanity lacked the capacity for genuine aggression, and that this display, however unsettling, was simply another symbolic gesture meant to intimidate rather than harm. I raised my hand, and to my surprise, given the tension in the room, I was granted permission to speak. I explained, as clearly as I could, that based on everything I had studied about human behavior, this restraint was not a sign of limitation. It was a choice, deliberate and controlled, meant to demonstrate exactly how much capability humanity possessed, while making clear that they had not yet chosen to use the full extent of it. I explained that Ethan Cole's warning, delivered days earlier, should not be dismissed as an empty statement, but understood as an accurate description of a decision that had already been made and was now being carried out in careful, escalating stages. I watched several officials exchange uncertain glances, though Threll dismissed my assessment quickly, insisting that a species incapable of causing a single injury during an operation of this scale could hardly be considered capable of following through on a threat as severe as the one Cole had made. He argued that the Council's proper response was to reinforce its defensive positions along the boundary, project strength rather than concern, and allow humanity's apparent aggression to run its course without granting it the satisfaction of a fearful reaction. The Council voted, over my objections and the objections of a small handful of officials who shared my growing unease, to increase defensive readiness without initiating any direct communication with Earth. Threll argued that reaching out now would appear as weakness, an admission that the Council feared retaliation for an incident it still officially maintained had been nothing more than an unfortunate accident. I left that session with the same helpless feeling I had carried since the day Laura Bennett died, the sense that I could see the shape of the disaster forming clearly, while everyone around me remained convinced that ancient authority alone would be enough to prevent it from arriving at their door. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern repeated itself with unsettling consistency. Additional outposts near the boundary of Threll's home system went dark, one after another, always in the same manner. Power systems disabled without damage. Defense grids silenced without a single shot fired. Crew members discovered unharmed but unconscious, unable to recall any details of what had happened to them beyond a brief flash of light, before losing awareness entirely. Each incident followed the same pattern, moving steadily inward, station by station, drawing closer to the heart of Threll's home system with each passing day. It became impossible for even the most dismissive officials to continue treating these events as isolated coincidences. Something was moving through Council space with total, methodical purpose, disabling every layer of defense one at a time, and doing so without leaving behind a single life lost or a single piece of physical evidence that might explain exactly how it was being accomplished. I began to understand, during this period, the true nature of what humanity had chosen to do. This was not an invasion in any traditional sense. There was no fleet visible on our sensors, no army marching through occupied territory, no display of overwhelming firepower meant to force a swift surrender. Instead, humanity had chosen a method of response that stripped away every layer of security Threll's people had built over generations, one careful step at a time, allowing the fear of what might come next to spread far faster and far deeper than any single, decisive strike ever could have. I raised this theory again during a smaller briefing attended by a handful of analysts and mid-level officials, suggesting that humanity's strategy relied not on destruction, but on demonstration, a methodical dismantling of capability, designed to leave Threll's people utterly unable to defend themselves by the time any true confrontation arrived, without ever crossing the line into the kind of large-scale loss of life that might unite the wider council against them in open condemnation. A few officials in that briefing began to take the theory seriously, though word of my growing influence within these discussions eventually reached Threll himself, who summoned me to a private meeting shortly afterward. I remember standing in his office, the same office where I had once overheard the conversation that first set this entire chain of events into motion, listening as he questioned me directly about the extent of my research into human behavior and the sources behind my increasingly detailed assessments. I answered honestly, describing my study of their history, their patterns, the calm, deliberate nature I had observed in both Laura Bennett and Ethan Cole during their visits to this station. I did not mention the overheard conversation from months earlier, unwilling to reveal what I knew until I better understood how that information might be used, or against whom. Threll listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in a way that unsettled me more than open anger might have. When I finished, he thanked me for my diligence and informed me that my analysis would be taken under advisement by the senior council moving forward. I left that meeting uncertain whether I had just been given a measure of validation or whether I had simply confirmed to the one person most responsible for this entire crisis exactly how much I understood about the danger closing in around us. 3 days later, the outpost stopped going dark, and for a brief, uneasy stretch, it seemed as though the pattern had finally reached its conclusion. I remember the cautious relief that spread through the station during those quiet days, officials daring to hope that whatever demonstration humanity intended to make had run its course, that perhaps this careful, restrained response had been the full extent of their intended reply. That relief lasted exactly 6 days. On the 7th day, every sensor array monitoring the approach to Threll's home system detected a single contact entering the system's outer boundary, moving with the same unhurried, deliberate pace that had characterized every human vessel we had encountered so far. This time, however, the readings carried a different weight, a different certainty among the analysts monitoring the display, because everyone in that room understood, without needing to be told, that whatever had been building toward this moment for the past several months had finally arrived at its true destination. I was granted temporary transfer to Threll's home system in the days following the outpost incidents, assigned to assist the local analytical staff, given my growing reputation as one of the few officials who had accurately predicted the pattern of escalation. I arrived 3 days before the single contact appeared at the system's boundary, and I remember the atmosphere among the local defense staff, a strange mixture of confidence and quiet dread that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Threll's home system served as one of the oldest and most heavily defended territories within the entire council, home to his people's capital world and the seat of generations of political power. Its defensive network had been built and reinforced over centuries, layered with automated platforms, crewed stations, and a standing fleet, capable, by every official measure, of repelling incursions from species far more advanced than humanity had ever demonstrated itself to be. When the single contact appeared at the outer boundary, the entire defense network moved to full readiness within minutes. I stood in the system's primary command center, watching alongside senior military officials as the vessel continued its slow, steady approach, showing no signs of evasive maneuvering, no attempt to conceal its position, moving as though it had already calculated every possible response the defenders might attempt, and found none of them worth adjusting its course for. The commanding officer on duty, a veteran named Vesik Doru, who had overseen this system's defenses for longer than I had been alive, ordered the outer platforms to establish a firm perimeter around the approaching vessel, broadcasting repeated demands that it identify itself and state its intentions before proceeding further into protected territory. The vessel did not respond to any of these demands. It simply continued forward, its pace never changing, until it reached a position roughly equidistant between the outer defense platforms and the system's primary populated world. There, it stopped. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The vessel held its position, motionless, while every defense platform in range trained its systems on the single contact, waiting for orders that Vesik Doru seemed hesitant to give without further guidance from the senior council. I remember the tension in that command center, a silence so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system cycling overhead, every officer present holding their breath as they waited to see what the vessel intended to do next. Then, without warning, every automated defense platform surrounding the vessel went dark simultaneously, their systems disabled in the same precise, controlled manner that had characterized every previous incident along the boundary. This time, however, the effect extended further than any single outpost. Within seconds, the disabling spread inward, moving through the system's defense network like a wave, silencing crewed stations, disarming orbital platforms, and finally reaching the standing fleet stationed near the capital world itself. I watched, frozen in place, as ship after ship across the display went dark, their weapon systems powering down, their engines idling to a stop, their crews reporting confusion and disorientation, but, once again, no injuries, no casualties, no physical damage of any kind. Within 20 minutes, every piece of military hardware within Threll's home system had been rendered completely inert, leaving the entire system, including its capital world, effectively defenseless against a single vessel that had not fired a single shot to accomplish what generations of engineering and military planning had been built specifically to prevent. Vesik Doru attempted to contact the senior council for guidance, but before the transmission could complete, a new signal arrived, broadcast directly to every remaining functional communication system within the system, overriding every other channel with a clarity that made clear this message was intended to reach every single person listening. The voice that spoke was calm, measured, carrying none of the anger I might have expected, given the scale of what had just been demonstrated. I recognized it immediately as Ethan Cole, the same soldier who had stood in the greeting hall months earlier and delivered his warning with the same unsettling composure. He stated, plainly, that everything the people of this system had just witnessed represented only a fraction of what humanity was capable of, and that this demonstration had been carried out specifically to avoid any loss of life, a courtesy extended only because the individuals within this system bore no direct responsibility for the decision that led to Laura Bennett's death. He explained that this courtesy would not extend to the one who had given that order, and that the time for demonstrations had now come to an end. He then stated a name, Counselor Threll. The command center fell into complete silence as every official present turned, almost in unison, toward the communications terminal, where Threll himself had been monitoring the situation remotely from his private office within the capital world's government complex. I watched the color drain from Vesik Doru's face as he processed what he had just heard, the full weight of what this meant finally settling over the room. Cole continued, his voice never wavering from its steady, level tone, explaining that Earth's investigation had confirmed, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Threll had personally ordered the tampering of Laura Bennett's guest quarters, resulting in her death, and had then orchestrated the falsified report that attributed her death to accidental malfunction. He stated that this evidence had been compiled and verified through methods he did not disclose, and that Earth's government considered the matter closed with respect to investigation, and now moved forward only with response. He gave no ultimatum. He made no demand for surrender, no request for Threll to be handed over, no negotiation of any kind. He simply stated that within the next several hours, the consequences of that decision would be carried out, and that anyone within the system who wished to avoid being caught within the scope of that response should evacuate any location directly associated with Threll's government immediately. The transmission ended as abruptly as it began, leaving the command center in a state of chaos that I had never witnessed in all my years of service. Officials shouted conflicting orders, attempting to reach Threll directly, attempting to reach the senior council for guidance, attempting to organize some form of evacuation despite having no clear understanding of what exactly they were evacuating from. I remember watching the tactical display throughout those following hours, the single human vessel remaining motionless in its position, showing no further activity, no additional movement, simply waiting, with the same patient stillness it had maintained since first arriving in the system. Whatever was coming, it seemed clear that this single vessel was not the instrument through which it would arrive. 6 hours after Cole's transmission ended, every sensor across the system detected a series of new contacts entering from multiple directions simultaneously. Vessels of a design our systems had never previously catalogued, moving with a speed and coordination that suggested a level of technological capability far beyond anything humanity had shown during its initial contact with the Council years earlier. I understood, watching those readings fill the display in front of me, that everything I had studied about humanity, every theory I had developed about their calm, their restraint, their careful, deliberate patience, had all been building toward this single moment, and that nothing in my years of research had adequately prepared me for what I was about to witness unfold across the system that had, until this day, been considered one of the most secure and heavily defended territories the Council had ever established. The new vessels moved through the system with a coordination that made every previous demonstration feel like a gentle warning compared to what unfolded over the following hours. I watched from the command center as one automated report after another flooded across the tactical display, each one confirming the same pattern that had already become familiar, yet somehow still managed to feel more overwhelming with every repetition. Every remaining orbital platform across the system lost power within minutes. Every shipyard, every fuel depot, every communication relay serving Threll's government fell silent in careful, deliberate sequence, as though the entire operation had been mapped out months in advance, waiting only for the order to begin. And still, through all of it, not a single report of injury or loss of life reached the command center. Every facility affected reported the same result: systems disabled, personnel unharmed, structures intact. I understood, watching this unfold, that humanity was not interested in destroying Threll's home system in any physical sense. They were interested in something far more precise, and in many ways far more devastating. They intended to remove every tool of power his government had ever relied upon, leaving behind a population fully intact, fully alive, but utterly stripped of the military and political strength that had defined their standing within the Council for centuries. Vesik Doru attempted repeatedly to reach the senior council for guidance, but every attempt to establish a connection beyond the system's boundary returned only silence, the same silence that had swallowed every communication attempt made toward the human vessels themselves. It became increasingly clear that we were witnessing something entirely isolated to Threll's home system, a response calculated specifically toward the individual and the government responsible for Laura Bennett's death, rather than any broader attack against the Council as a whole. Reports began arriving from the capital world itself roughly 2 hours after the new vessels appeared, describing government facilities losing power in the same controlled manner as the military installations before them. Administrative buildings, communication centers, and defense coordination offices across the capital went dark one after another. Their staff evacuated safely, as automated warnings within each facility activated moments before shutdown, giving everyone inside sufficient time to leave before the systems disabled entirely. I remember watching footage from a surveillance feed near the capital's central government complex, the building where Threll maintained his private office, as warning systems throughout the structure activated in sequence, guiding staff calmly toward exits, with an efficiency that felt almost designed to prevent panic rather than cause it. Within 30 minutes, the entire complex stood empty, its power systems fully disabled, its defenses rendered completely useless. Yet not a single person inside had been harmed during the process. Threll himself was not among those evacuated peacefully. I learned later, through reports compiled in the days following the incident, that a separate, smaller vessel had approached the government complex directly during the evacuation, bypassing the remaining security personnel with the same precision that had characterized every other action taken throughout the day. Threll was removed from the building before its systems went fully dark, taken by a small team that left no trace of confrontation behind, no damage to the surrounding structure, nothing beyond his sudden and complete absence from a location he had occupied only minutes earlier. The senior council, once contact was finally re-established nearly 6 hours after the operation began, received a single transmission from Earth's government, delivered not through Ethan Cole this time, but through a formal diplomatic channel that had remained dormant since the day humanity first withdrew from Council space months earlier. The message was brief. It confirmed that Counselor Threll had been taken into human custody, to be tried under a framework of accountability that Earth's government had developed specifically for addressing crimes committed against its citizens by foreign officials, regardless of where those crimes took place. It confirmed that every military and administrative capability belonging to Threll's home government had been permanently dismantled, effectively removing his people's capacity to project political or military influence beyond their own borders for the foreseeable future. It stated clearly that the population of the system had not been harmed, that essential services would be restored under careful human oversight to prevent any humanitarian crisis, and that this restoration would continue only so long as the transition remained peaceful. Finally, the message stated that this response applied specifically and exclusively to those directly responsible for the decision that led to Laura Bennett's death, and that no further action would be taken against the wider council, provided no similar decision was ever made again against a human representative in the future. I remember sitting in stunned silence as that message finished playing across every screen in the command center, the full weight of what had just occurred settling slowly over everyone present. An entire government, one that had stood for centuries as a pillar of council authority, had been rendered powerless within the span of a single day, without a single life lost, without a single structure destroyed, through nothing more than careful, overwhelming precision. The senior council convened an emergency session within hours, and this time, given the scale of what had happened, every official across every member species scrambled to understand exactly what humanity had proven itself capable of, and what that capability meant for the fragile balance of power that had defined galactic politics for 10,000 years. I was called to testify before that session, asked to provide my assessment of humanity's likely intentions moving forward, given my months of study into their behavior leading up to this moment. I stood before the assembled elders, species far older and more powerful than my own, and explained as clearly as I could that everything humanity had done throughout this entire crisis had been carried out with deliberate, controlled restraint, aimed specifically and exclusively at those responsible for a single death, rather than any broader ambition toward conquest or domination. I explained that this restraint should not be mistaken for limitation. Humanity had demonstrated a capability to dismantle an entire government's military and political power in a matter of hours, without loss of life, a level of precision that suggested capabilities far beyond anything our own surveys had ever detected. I explained that the true lesson of this crisis was not that humanity intended to conquer the galaxy, but that they possessed both the capability and the willingness to respond with total, overwhelming precision to any harm inflicted upon their own people, regardless of the power or status held by whoever caused that harm. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, every official present grappling with the implications of what I had just described. For the first time in the Council's long history, an entire assembly of ancient, powerful species sat together in genuine uncertainty, forced to reconsider assumptions about power and authority that had gone unquestioned for longer than most of them could remember. I left that session understanding that the galaxy I had known my entire life had changed permanently that day, though it would take much longer for the full shape of that change to become clear to everyone else who had witnessed it alongside me. In the months that followed, I watched the entire structure of galactic politics reshape itself around a truth that no one could deny any longer, no matter how uncomfortable that truth remained, for those who had spent centuries believing themselves untouchable. Humanity had not conquered a single world. They had not claimed new territory, had not demanded tribute, had not sought to expand their influence beyond the boundaries they already held. And yet, every member species within the Council now approached them with a caution previously reserved only for powers far older and far more established than a species barely a decade into formal recognition. I was reassigned shortly after the crisis concluded, transferred from my former position within Threll's now dissolved administrative structure to a newly created liaison office responsible for maintaining direct communication with Earth's government. I accepted the position without hesitation, curious to understand more directly the people who had reshaped an entire galaxy's understanding of power within the span of a single, carefully controlled operation. My first formal meeting in this new role took place with a human representative named Grace Whitlow, appointed to oversee the transition of diplomatic relations following the events surrounding Threll's removal. She carried herself with the same calm, measured presence I had come to associate with every human representative I had encountered, though I noticed, spending time with her over the following weeks, that this calm was not simply a personal trait unique to a select few individuals. It seemed woven into the way humanity approached conflict as an institution, a cultural discipline built around patience, precision, and a refusal to escalate beyond what any given situation truly required. I asked her once, during a quiet moment between formal sessions, why humanity had chosen restraint throughout the entire crisis, given the scale of harm they were clearly capable of inflicting had they chosen a different path. She considered the question carefully before answering, explaining that her government had never sought conflict with the Council, and that every action taken throughout the crisis had been calculated specifically to address the individuals responsible for Laura Bennett's death, without punishing an entire population for decisions made by leadership those citizens had never had any say in shaping. She explained further that humanity's history was filled with lessons about the difference between strength used carelessly and strength used deliberately, and that her government had chosen, from the very beginning of this crisis, to demonstrate the second kind rather than the first, precisely because doing otherwise would have confirmed every fear the Council secretly held about the newest species to join their ranks. I found myself reflecting on those words often in the months that followed, watching the wider galaxy adjust to a new understanding of where humanity stood within the established hierarchy that had governed relations between species for 10,000 years. No formal declaration was ever made, elevating humanity's status within the Council's rigid structure. No treaty was signed acknowledging a shift in power, and yet, subtle changes appeared everywhere I looked, in the way other species addressed human representatives during official sessions, in the careful language used whenever humanity's name arose in policy discussions, in the quiet, unspoken understanding that had settled over every remaining member of the Council. Species that had once treated humanity with the same casual condescension shown to any newly recognized member, now approached diplomatic exchanges with noticeably increased caution. Ceremonial requirements that had once been rigidly enforced across every species regardless of preference were quietly revised, allowing for greater flexibility in how visiting representatives could choose to participate in traditional greetings. I noticed, during several sessions I attended in my new role, that officials who had once dismissed my early warnings about humanity's behavior now sought out my analysis directly, eager to understand a species whose calm restraint had proven far more unsettling than any display of open aggression could have been. Threll's trial, held under human oversight, according to the framework outlined in Earth's original transmission, concluded several months after the crisis began, though I was not permitted to attend given the sensitivity surrounding proceedings involving a former high-ranking council official. I learned only that the trial had been conducted with the same careful precision humanity had shown throughout the entire situation, offering him a full opportunity to present his account of events, while ultimately confirming the same conclusion Ethan Cole had stated during his initial visit to the boundary system months earlier. I never learned the specific details of what became of Threll following the trial's conclusion, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not feel compelled to ask. Whatever justice humanity's framework ultimately delivered, it seemed to close the matter with a finality that satisfied the wider council's need to move forward, without inviting the kind of ongoing controversy that might have kept the wound of Laura Bennett's death open indefinitely. His home system, meanwhile, began a slow, careful process of rebuilding under a new governing structure, established with guidance from both the Council and Earth's Transitional Oversight Team. I visited briefly during one of my liaison assignments, curious to see firsthand what remained of a territory that had once stood among the most powerful within the entire Council. I found a population adjusting to a new reality, grateful, if somewhat uneasily, for the fact that their lives had continued largely uninterrupted, despite the complete collapse of the government that had ruled over them for generations. I often think back to the early days of this crisis, to the quiet unease I felt standing in that greeting hall the day Laura Bennett refused to kneel, unable to fully articulate why that single moment felt so significant, even as everyone around me dismissed it as a minor diplomatic footnote. I think about Ethan Cole's calm, measured warnings, delivered without anger, without theater, carrying a weight that few in that room understood, until it was far too late to change the course events had already been set upon. I think, most of all, about a lesson that spread quietly across every corner of the galaxy in the months following that crisis. A lesson that required no formal announcement, no official decree, because it had already been demonstrated with a clarity that no species who witnessed it could ever fully forget. Humanity did not seek power for its own sake. They did not threaten, did not posture, did not demand recognition through displays of force. But when harm came to one of their own, they responded not with rage, not with chaos, but with a controlled, deliberate precision that reshaped an entire government's fate within a single day, all while leaving every innocent life within that government's territory completely untouched. The Council no longer refers to humanity as simply the newest member species, a label that once carried an unspoken assumption of inferiority within our rigid hierarchy. I have heard, in quiet conversations among officials from a dozen different species since that crisis concluded, a phrase that has taken root across the galaxy, spoken carefully, almost reverently, whenever humanity's name arises in discussions of power and diplomacy. They call them, simply, the ones who never warn you twice. I find, even now, that I understand exactly why.